Hello all, today is the day where I cover something that I wanted to cover for quite some time. Video games have a very special place in my heart, particularly old video games. I can name hundreds of classics that helped shape who I am as a person today, but as time goes on and technology grows stronger, we move past using certain techniques and control layouts and grow into using different and easier ones, making older games a lot harder to play for both us and newer generations, especially if they don't have the required console. But it would be a shame for a man to grow old without being able to experience the likes of Spyro or Resident Evil, just to name two, so we remake these bad boys. I actually think that remakes can be a big negative for the most part, but more on that later. Now, remaking or remastering a video game is no easy task. Rockstar proved just that when they shamelessly released their remakes of GTA 3, Vice City and San Andreas.
It's the biggest piece of dog shit.
You have to get the balance right. If you change too little about a game, then you'll be criticised for a lack of imagination, but if you change too much, you'll be criticised for not being faithful enough. And let's not lie, I think both sides have very good points, but it proves just how hard that it is. But I'm going to look back at and discuss many different IPs who either succeeded or failed in this department. But the absolute first thing we must mention first is the one company, the one group of mad lads who understand perfectly time and time again how to perfectly remake a video game, and their name is Capcom. In 2002, Capcom released a remake of Resident Evil just 6 years after its initial release. Now, not that that stopped anyone before, I'm sorry, but I just cannot condone remastering a game after a year. It's absolutely criminal, but more on that later. Resident Evil 1 remake releases, and it's good. Even by today's standards, I'd say it's one of, if not the greatest remake of all time, given what it had to work with. It really set the standard for what a remake should be. It took a somewhat goofy and cheesy atmosphere and made it into one of those few that really sticks with you. You know how you turn each corner at a snail's pace. The art direction is unreal, especially given the originals, and as for the setting, the mansion, mate, sucks you in every time. From the moment you enter, you feel compelled to explore each and every room of that place. It also has one of those soundtracks that makes you feel like there is something lurking in the darkness at all times. Not many forms of media in history have managed that. No matter how empty those rooms are, you ain't gonna feel alone. I love this game, but would you believe it, there is clamour to remake the remake. I'll admit this game is dated. It feels like you need to be a qualified fighter jet pilot to control the direction that Jill is walking in, but it's such a shame too, because it feels like the remake is almost lost to time and forgotten about, when in reality it's a borderline masterpiece. Fast forward, the year is 2019, Resident Evil has just been saved by its 7th installment after the disaster that was 6, and a remake of 2 is announced. I'm not going to beat around the bush here, it releases and oh my god it slaps. It redefined what it meant to be a remake. Capcom executed tank controls for better or worse and made it a comfortable over-the-shoulder experience. The horror is ramped up with the zombies looking perhaps the best I've ever seen in a video game, and being stalked and followed by Mr. X still gives me the heebie-jeebies to this very day. The graphical style of Resident Evil 2 is one of the best I've ever seen. Like, this game is absolutely gorgeous. At the time, the clamour and hype surrounding this game was unreal. I've never seen anything quite like it. At the end of the day, this game was another trendsetter. It became known as the patient zero of remakes. If a game was remade or remastered, it was immediately compared to RE2 to question whether it was perfectly faithful and as adapted as this second installment in the rebooted timeline. And well, that's it then. A remake of 3 is needed to complete the trilogy, right? It takes them not even a year. Okay, a bit worrying, and they've cut so much content out. Okay, I'm sure it will still be great. The main villain boils down to I like money. Okay, well, it's 3 hours. The game itself is fine, like it's good, I think, but the mark is missed and it proves the age-old saying of there are no good third installments. See, I didn't play the original, it was a bit before my time, but I know people who did, and they're easily the people who are the most frustrated when it comes to this game. And it's a fair point, because if you remade RE2 but then cut out the clock tower section, fans would be rightfully annoyed. Despite this though, I remember finishing it in just 3 hours and thinking, is that it? Is that the peak of technology nowadays? I have a lot of respect for Capcom, but it really seems like they rushed this one for revenue, and that's the point I'm getting to. Most remakes now are cash cows. Look at the GTA trilogy, it was absolutely embarrassing for Rockstar. Bar 3, Capcom are the only company that really seem to know what it takes to remake a classic. Speaking of. It's actually not been all that long since Resident Evil 4 released, you know, the remake. Did Capcom get this one right? Yes! They nailed it with this one. Resident Evil is known as gaming's most iconic horror franchise, and whilst RE4 is undoubtedly one of the best games of all time, it really missed that feeling of horror and started a bit of a downward spiral in the franchise when it came to spookiness and more of a focus on action. It has a good atmosphere, granted, but there was never a moment where I felt threatened. A good horror game, show or movie is one where you feel threatened and unsafe in real life. This may sound silly, but don't act as though as a kid you've never stayed in your bedroom, too scared to leave in case the boogeyman gets you because of a film you've just watched. Those are the good ones. The original Halloween movie is the first one that comes to mind. When they remade them, it was clear and obvious that they didn't really know what they were doing and kind of dropped a ball with it. The Halloween of last year, I watched the OG Myers movie with someone, and I kid you not, they wanted to turn it off after an hour. Now, that could just mean they're a massive pussy, granted, but it could also go to show just how unnerving this movie actually is and how unsafe it made you feel. I can't really think of a game that made me feel this way since, well, truth be told, PT. Now that's a game that gets horror right, but my point is, the remake of RE4 is a damn sight scarier than the original, not to point where I'm shitting myself and cowering under my bed, but it's probably the best job they did in horror terms since the remake of RE1, especially since they had so little to work with in the original. The game's biggest weakness is that it's a remake, because no matter what you do with it, you're always going to be comparing it to the original, and hence the main issues with remakes. I'm going to jump into other games now just to prove this point, but as explained, Resident Evil is the only series to get remakes right from what I've seen. I'm sure 3 was a bit misguided, but you can look at The Last of Us, which remastered the game barely a year after it came out. Like, what is the point of that? As I said, I'm going to go a bit deeper here. The best remakes reinvent, not just revisit. Dead Space was another title that recently got a remake, and I tell you what, well done developers, because that is another case of it done right. The thing is though, I'd say the original Dead Space still holds up remarkably well, so it didn't make much sense at first to redo it, but it was a bit of a genre definer when it came out, the original that is. Despite this though, the remake does fix the original's very dated zero-gravity sections, and I would say its combat system does feel innovative. But even with the newly recorded dialogue, I didn't get the sense that the remake was interested in pulling more from the original. In an interview actually, the developer team claimed their idea and concept simply came from being fans of the OG and wanting to do it justice. To me, that stands in total contrast to the likes of The Last of Us remake. A game that came out in 2013 to immense praise and reception, so obviously it would still hold up today. This is why it's important to be wary of most remakes, because they're simply used to generate cash from fans of the original. I understand The Last of Us was a technical masterpiece and can work well on any media as proved by the TV show, but no game past the year 2010 at the very latest should be subject to a remake. I understand the game had great accessibility features, apparently, and whatnot, but does that really justify a full redo? A great comparison I'd like to make is that of the 1998 Psycho, a remake of the Hitchcock classic that was very, very loyal. Most shots were effectively frame for frame, and the only real differences that were noticeable were gore effects that Hitchcock obviously didn't have access to at the time. A similar way that remakes will release, and the only glaring change will be the graphics. It is this issue that leads me to believe that the art of the remake can be a problem. I can't help but feel like Resident Evil 2 really made the industry fall in love with the idea of a remake, but that's the only one to do it correctly, at least in my opinion. I once read a justification of remaking a game as making it perfect. All I can really say to that is, art is not perfect, nothing is. You can take any piece of media created in the history of our species, and I absolutely guarantee there will be at least one thing you can pick it apart for. So the idea of attempting to perfect some of our greatest stories and experiences are just plain silly. This is actually why, to me, in most cases, I think a remaster can be more beneficial than a remake, because all it does is make it look better, which is fine, unless in the case of the Bioshock remaster, which was frankly embarrassing, but a remake can often lose sight of the original vision. An argument I see sometimes is a remake can turn a once subpar franchise into something greater. That is true. This is exactly why I believe a remake of Dino Crisis would be greatly beneficial, because just imagine what they could do with the technology now. But then you can also hinder a game's legacy. Look at the GTA trilogy again. That really made me not only lose faith in Rockstar, but look back on those games with a sense of, Jesus, did they always play this bad? It can sometimes make you look back on everything as, well, if this polished version is terrible, then maybe the original isn't quite what I remember. Another one I've been told about is Final Fantasy VII, which tells a radically different story than the original, leaving many dissatisfied from what I've seen. They're also planning to remake the 2016 hit Horizon Zero Dawn, and it's like, how are you remaking a game that's still classed as an incredible step forward even today? How much are you really going to be adding to that experience? In the case of RE4, a game not really needing a remake, it improves the controls, creates a much more intimidating atmosphere, and it improves the graphics tenfold. For a game like Horizon Zero Dawn, how much can you really change or introduce? The idea of such a project does expose how difficult it'll be for publishers to justify expensive prices for games that really don't need the polishing. As the game release calendar clogs up with remakes, I find myself asking why. That's not a dig or a jab at every one of them, because if done right, they can be a groundbreaking and phenomenal game that pushes the boundaries and helps developers see their original vision come to life with today's graphics and controls. But despite that, I can't help but feel like the time and money would be better spent advancing a series and crafting new and interesting ideas. Truth be told, I don't want to see the same old stories retold again and again. I swear, video games are the only media where you can get away with this. Literally any movie that has been remade has always turned out bad. But whilst there is the negative approach to take, you can always look at the Resident Evil 2 argument, as I like to call it, where a developer sees his vision realised and the game comes out as a standalone masterpiece. Though, you can also make the argument of taking the tank controls out make it not nearly as scary or unique as the original. Encounters with enemies were much more terrifying with limited controls, almost realistic in a way, and players not being able to control the characters could be a skill issue. It's a tough one to call, honestly. The problem is many players love the original games and are quite so precious about what is changed and what isn't, and you can't really blame them for that. There's no way in the movie industry you'd get away with remaking a movie and taking out key points and dialogue. Whether that be the removal of Ashley's ballistics in RE4 or an old gender bathroom in Dead Space causing a stir, the truth is, there is always going to be issues to be taken with remakes and remasters, but unfortunately how you have to see it is, if you don't like it, play the originals. Thank you for listening to my ramblings today. I just wanted to quickly dive down the remake rabbit hole because after playing RE4, it really got me thinking about how these companies actually justify these huge prices for what is essentially a retelling of a story that in some cases are watered down versions of much cheaper originals. If I'm being 100% honest though, I'd like to see remakes stop for the time being unless the title is Dino Crisis, because that is something that would perhaps interest me. If you agreed with what I'd say here, or even if you didn't, feel free to leave your thoughts on remakes, remasters or whatever in the comments, and maybe in your opinion, what is the greatest remake or remaster of all time? But yeah, that's about all I have to say for now. Speak to you soon.